Welcome to Firearms Friday, coming to you from the Wyoming State Museum here in Cheyenne. I'm Evan Green. I'm the firearms historian for the museum, and I have what I think is an interesting story to tell you today, but if you're squeamish, you might want to pass or have the pause button in hand, because this involves the ambush assassination of two law enforcement officers. It involves two separate lynchings of miscreants. It involves the desecration of two different corpses. So, again, if you're squeamish, have that pause button at hand. The rifle that lets me talk about this story is this model 1876 Winchester. And this was introduced by Winchester in 1876 in an attempt to have a repeating firearm that was powerful enough to be used in the buffalo hunts and for encounters with grizzly bears and the large big game that was prominent in the Rocky Mountain area and on the plains at the time. This design was the last of the toggle bolt actions. And I'm going to do a video about the evolution of Winchester lever actions that will explain a little bit more about the toggle action, but it was not a particularly strong action. And the design was also very sensitive to the cartridge overall length. And it was neither strong enough nor designed to accommodate the standard military cartridge of the day, the 4570 Springfield. So, spoiler alert, maybe there's no connection here, but it does allow me to segue into the story about a guy named Big Nose George. And Big Nose George and his gang were active in the 1870s. They held up stagecoaches on the Cheyenne to Deadwood stage. They bushwhacked and in some cases killed mail carriers. Just in general, not the pleasantest of guys. But there was a gang of 5 or 6 of them, maybe as many as 8, and rumor has it that included in that gang might well have been Frank and Jesse James. I'll share a book with you here in a minute about by an individual who was intimately involved in the research regarding this particular incident. But anyway, Big Nose George and his gang held up a westbound train, and took watches and money and gear from the passengers. And after the fact, a newspaper said, why did they hold up the westbound train? It's the eastbound train that carries all the gold and money. Well, thank you, newspaper. So Big Nose George and his guys, not being stupid, said, okay, we're going to hold up the westbound train. And their plan was they went out to this area in Carbon County and they removed, it's called a fish plate. That's a part of the unit that attaches the rails to the ties. Took out some spikes and looped telegraph wire around the rail. The idea was when the train came through, they would pull that rail out of alignment, the train would wreck, and they could go in and take all the gold. A track crew spotted the misaligned rail or the wire and the missing plates, fixed it, and went back and reported that there had been this obvious attempt to derail the train. So a Union Pacific detective named Vincent and a Carbon County deputy sheriff named Widowfield went out, picked up the trail of these guys, and followed them into a camp. And I think it was Vincent who was smart enough to say, oh, well, I guess we're not going to find our missing cattle here, because he sensed that there might have been an ambush. Widowfield, unfortunately, got off his horse, knelt down by the campfire, and said, these coals are still hot. They got to be really close. And they were. They shot and killed Widowfield from ambush. Vincent tried to get away. They shot him in the back and killed him. So, as often happens, that outlaws are not the smartest people in the world. Big Nose George Parrott was up in Montana, got drunk, started bragging about his escapades. So he was arrested, and at a different point in time, a gang member named Dutch Charlie was arrested. He was put on the train to go back to Rawlins for trial. Vigilantes stopped the train at the little town of Carbon, took Dutch Charlie off the train, and lynched him. They tried to do the same thing with Big Nose George, but Big Nose George, not having honor among thieves, said, wait, don't lynch me, I'll tell everybody everything I know. So they sent him on to jail in Rawlins. But while he was in Rawlins, he was tried and sentenced to be hanged. And within a fairly short time before he was to be hanged, he attempted to escape jail. He was able somehow to cut off the rivets that held his shackles, and he used those to attack the jailer, a guy named Rankin, and was attempting to get out when Rankin's wife took a handgun and herded him right back into his jail cell. This outraged the good citizens of Rawlins, and they took him out and lynched him. And this is where the story gets a little strange, because there was a doctor newly arrived in Rawlins named John Osborne. And in those days, it was a big thing to say, well, he's a criminal, it must be something wrong with his brain. So Osborne conducted the autopsy, and as a part of that autopsy, cut the top of Big Nose George's skull off, looked at the brain and said, oh, whatever, and gave that top of the skull to a 16-year-old girl who went on to become the first female doctor in the state of Wyoming, and had that skull top in her possession for years and years until she passed away. So this is where it gets gruesome. John Osborne had the corpse skinned, had that skin tanned, had a medical bag and a pair of shoes made from Big Nose George's skin. And John Osborne wore those shoes when he was inaugurated as the first Democrat governor of the state of Wyoming. So it gets stranger from there. In 1950, there was an excavation going on in Rawlins for a new building, and they dug up a whiskey barrel. And when they opened it, it had the bones of Big Nose George and the rest of his skull in that barrel. And there was an investigation. I'm going to recommend this excellent book to you, which is by Mark Miller. You may recall that I interviewed him several episodes ago about the Milk Creek fight. But anyway, just amazing connections. Mark Miller's great-grandfather was the sheriff of Carbon County at the time Big Nose George was in jail there. Mark Miller was the state archaeologist and conducted the investigation, which verified two things. One, the shoes were made out of human skin, and two, the top part of the skull matched the bottom part of the skull, so it was definitely Big Nose George that had been buried in that barrel. So again, I recommend this book, and our videographer, Dean Peterson, has an excellent podcast about Big Nose George, and I'll ask him to put a link to that podcast in the section below so you could get to that. But again, it's kind of interesting, the connection that Mark Miller's great-grandfather was the guy who was in charge of the jail at the time. So, Big Nose George, his troublesome trail, and a pretty strange story from Wyoming history. Thank you for watching. If you got questions or comments, you can record those below, or you can call the museum and leave a message for me. I'm not here every day, but they will take a message, and I would get back to you. if you want to talk about guns or Wyoming history. So thank you for watching.